Two parties, one monopoly. Policy Agreement 5 between the two parties. Foreign election meddling. There are hundreds of cases of economic and military blackmail, election fraud, assassination, and violent overthrow of democratically elected leaders in Europe, East Asia, North Africa, and more. Let's go through a few examples of where the United States, under the leadership of both political parties, has interfered in the elections of other countries. Italy, 1948 election. The 1948 Italian general election was greatly influenced by the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The CIA, by its own admission, gave $1 million to Italian centrist parties such as the Christian Democrats, as well as publishing forged letters in order to discredit the Italian Communist Party leaders. The legal authority for these actions in Italy came about around 6 months after the passage of the National Security Act of 1947, signed into law by U.S. President Harry Truman, which legalized and funded foreign covert operations. CIA operative Felton Mark Wyatt described the CIA's involvement in the election, saying, "We had bags of money that we delivered to selected politicians to defray their political expenses, their campaign expenses, for posters, for pamphlets." U.S. agencies undertook a campaign of writing 10 million letters, made numerous radio broadcasts, and funded the publishing of articles and books, all of which warned the Italians of what was believed to be the consequences of a communist victory.
Italy stands at the crossroads of history as her millions of qualified voters stream to the polls to determine whether she shall remain a free republic or sink silently behind the Iron Curtain in the gray zone where slave nations are governed by Moscow's will. The election, which lasts almost 2 full days, is held under the watchful eyes of 300,000 troops and police. It is the culmination of a bitter battle in which both Western powers and Russia exert strong pressure. Trieste, often a political pawn, again finds itself an issue in the East-West struggle. The United States has advocated its return to Italy. Russia has flatly rejected the proposal. Citizens hear arguments from both sides. 574 deputies and control of the Senate are the stakes in this desperately fought election. Leading freedom-loving Italians is Prime Minister De Gasperi, head of the Christian Democratic Party, who has the solid backing of the church, whose home is menaced by communist aggression. His followers are supported by millions of letters from Italian Americans and hundreds of shiploads of American food. Palmiro Togliatti, Moscow-trained and considered one of Europe's outstanding Reds, leads the communists in their desperate campaign of violence. The elected officials will determine Italy's government, slave or free. But as 29 million Italians face their grave responsibility, returns indicate a sweeping victory for the forces of freedom. An anxious world breathes easier, as with incomplete returns tabulated, Italy meets communism's challenge with a resounding no.
Time magazine backed the campaign and featured the Christian Democrat leader and Prime Minister Alcide de Gasperi on its cover and its head story on the 19th of April, 1978. The Christian Democrats eventually won the 1948 election with 48% of the vote. The CIA's practice of influencing the political situation was repeated in every Italian election for decades after. The Philippines, 1940s to 1980s. Being regarded as a stronghold of U.S. imperial power in Asia, the Philippines, and more specifically the capital, Manila, has been a regional headquarters for the United States CIA for quite some time. Intelligence collection in Manila is also part of a covert and offensive operation where people, ideas, or places that are deemed to be threats to the United States were attacked and neutralized. The CIA and Joint U.S. Military Advisory Group, JUSMAG, engineered the bloody suppression of the Nationalist People's Liberation Army, or HMB. Success from this CIA suppression was made into a model for future counterinsurgency operations in Vietnam and Latin America. Philippine President Ramon Magsaysay, 1953 to 1957, entrusted Colonel Edward Lansdale as his military advisor. Secretly, Lansdale was working for the CIA and funneled $1 million of agency money to Magsaysay, along with additional funds from the Coca-Cola Company. The CIA also established the Transatlantic Airlines Incorporated as a front to recruit veteran Filipino war pilots and military intelligence who were still active. CIA agents Lansdale and Napoleon D. Valerino used their counter-guerrilla experiences in the Philippines to train covert operatives for Vietnam and guerrilla assassins for Latin America. The Philippines became the CIA's prototype in a successful covert operations and psychological warfare. On April 18, 1973, National Security Advisor at the time, Henry Kissinger, had discussed providing assistance in improving the Manila police's equipment. In a lecture given at the University of the Philippines, Manila on August 18, 2000, Roland B. Simbiolan, coordinator of the Manila Studies Program, said about the CIA in the Philippines. The CIA in the Philippines has engaged in countless covert operations for the intervention of and dirty tricks, particularly in Philippine domestic policies. On top of all this, the U.S. diplomatic mission, especially the political section that is a favorite cover for the CIA operatives. CIA front companies also provide an additional but convenient layer for operatives assigned overseas. In general, whenever you find it U.S. big business interests, you also find a very active CIA. Dominican Republic. On May 30th, 1961, Dominican Republic President Rafael Trujillo, who had warm relations with the United States, was assassinated on May 30th, 1961. In February 1963, a democratically elected government under Juan Bosch, who was the first democratically elected president of the Dominican Republic, took office, but it was overthrown shortly thereafter in September 1963. In April 1965, after 19 months of military rule, a pro-Bosch revolt broke out. Days later, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson, concerned that the communists might take over the revolt and create a second Cuba, sent the Marines, followed immediately by U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division and other elements of the 18th Airborne Corps, in Operation Paperback. Johnson remarked, "We don't propose to sit here in a rocking chair with our hands folded and let the communists set up any government in the Western Hemisphere," Johnson said.
I reported to them on the serious situation in the Dominican Republic. I reported the decisions that this government considers necessary in this situation in order to protect American lives. The members of the leadership expressed their support of these decisions. The United States government has been informed by military authorities in the Dominican Republic that American lives are in danger. These authorities are no longer able to guarantee their safety, and they have reported that the assistance of military personnel is now needed for that purpose. I have ordered the Secretary of Defense to put the necessary American troops ashore in order to give protection to hundreds of Americans who are still in the Dominican Republic and to escort them safely back to this country. This same assistance will be available to the nationals of other countries, some of whom have already asked for our help. Pursuant to my instructions, 400 Marines have already landed. General Wheeler, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has just reported to me that there have been no incidents. We have appealed repeatedly in recent days for a ceasefire between the contending forces in the Dominican Republic in the interest of all Dominicans and foreigners alike.
These American forces remained inside the country for over a year and left after supervising elections in 1966, won by Joaquin Balaguer. He had been Trujillo's last puppet president. Off and on, he was president for around 20 years. Democratic Republic of the Congo. Patrice Lumumba was a Congolese politician and independence leader who served as the first prime minister of the independent Democratic Republic of the Congo from June until September 1960. He played a significant role in the transformation of the Congo from a colony of Belgium into an independent republic. Ideologically pan-African and pan-nationalist, he led the movement called National Congolese, or MNC, Party from 1958 until his murder in 1961. President of the Congo, Kasavubu, began fearing a Lumumba coup would take place. On September 5, 1960, Kasavubu announced over the radio that he had dismissed Lumumba and 6 of his ministers from the government for involving the Soviets in the Congo. Upon hearing the broadcast, Lumumba made his way to the national radio station, which was under UN guard. Though they had been ordered to bar Lumumba's entry, the UN troops allowed the Prime Minister in. Lumumba denounced his dismissal over the radio as illegitimate, and in turn labeled Kasavubu a traitor and declared him deposed. He proceeded to Parliament and launched into a debate in which he, in the words of American Ambassador Claire Timberlake, devastated the points raised by the opposition and made Kasavubu look ridiculous. The newly appointed Prime Minister, Senator Leader Joseph Illiel, failed to secure a vote of confidence, which Lumumba then won in the Senate 41-2, with 6 abstaining. Parliament did not back Lumumba's dismissal of Kasavubu, however, creating a constitutional crisis. On September 13th, the Parliament held a joint session between the Senate and the Assembly. They voted to grant Lumumba emergency powers. The next day, a coup organized by Colonel Mobutu politically incapacitated both Lumumba and Kasavubu. With logistical support from the United States and Belgium, Mobutu's troops managed to capture Lumumba. Mobutu claimed that Lumumba would be tried for inciting the army to a rebellion and other crimes. A report in 2001 by the Belgian Commission of Inquiry mentions that there had been previous U.S. and Belgian plans to kill Lumumba. Among them was a CIA-sponsored attempt to poison Lumumba, which came on the orders of U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The CIA station chief, Larry Devlin, helped to direct the search, capture, and transfer of Lumumba to his enemies in Katanga. Devlin was involved in arranging Lumumba's transfer to Katanga. The CIA base station chief in Elizabethville was in direct touch with the killers the night Lumumba was killed. Declassified documents reveal that the CIA also had previously plotted to assassinate Lumumba. These documents indicate that the Congolese leaders who killed Lumumba received money and weapons directly from the CIA. The inauguration of U.S. President John F. Kennedy in January 1961 caused fears within the CIA that the incoming administration would shift its favor to the imprisoned Lumumba. While awaiting his presidential inauguration, Kennedy had come to believe that Lumumba should be released from custody. Lumumba was killed 3 days before Kennedy's inauguration on January 20th, 1961. This series of events allowed Colonel Mobutu Sese Seko, who was backed by Belgium and the U.S., to take power and gain control of the country for around 32 years.
The CIA's main concern in Africa was to prevent the Soviets from gaining any sort of stronghold in the continent, and efforts were focused on one huge country at the heart of the region, the Congo.
Within days of formal independence, Congo was in complete turmoil. Patrice Lumumba, who was the prime minister at that stage, was asking the Soviets to help. There were hundreds of Soviet advisors flying into the airport and who were then broadcasting propaganda to the Congolese army.
Lumumba's behavior was completely unacceptable to the CIA. So the agents in the Congo began to look for a replacement, and they found one in a young man called Mobutu.
The CIA first spotted Mobutu as a potential collaborator in 1960. They regarded him as very intelligent, very immature, but very promising.
new chapter begins in the dark and tragic history of the Congo with the return to Leopoldville of deposed Premier Lumumba, following his capture by crack commandos of strongman Colonel Mobutu.
On January 17th, 1961, Lumumba was dragged into the jungle, beaten and then murdered by troops loyal to Mobutu. The CIA had got its way. Their man Mobutu was now in charge of the Congo, and the Soviets were no longer welcome there.
Lumumba was removed to an army prison.
He was a very helpful, earnest, clever, non-ideological young man from very humble, rather complicated background, who Western people found very useful.
He was very much indeed a strong man, a strong personality, and Congo became his backyard. He had everything for himself. He controlled everything himself. And thus he became, even at the time, even the most richest guy on earth.
Over his lifetime, he was reckoned to have taken 4 billion, equivalent to half of the Congo's GDP. And what did he spend it on? Lots of quote-unquote palaces, which included a whole compound in Gabadalite. It looked like Disney, but it cost a great deal of money. Mobutu had a small airport, but not so small that Concorde couldn't regularly land and take off there, because Concorde was hired for shopping trips to Paris. There is no question that the CIA knew the order of theft. Of course they knew.
Mobutu's greed was matched only by his cruelty, and it was the people of the Congo who paid the high price during his 32 years in power.
He became like an animal. He became like a lion.
Je m'appelle Mobutu.
People were very scared about Mobutu. If you touch Mobutu's politics or Mobutu's interests, you are finished, man. You are gone.
I think if you look back, what becomes harder and harder to defend is the fact that the CIA kept supporting Mobutu until the 90s. I find that astonishing. Today, Congo is a source of tremendous instability. It's had a civil war that has led to 3.7 million deaths. It is one of the most unstable, poorest and most anarchic countries in Africa. I've now spent 10 years in Africa, and every African I've ever met believes that if something happens in his country that is negative and damaging, the CIA was behind it. But they have good reason to think that, because the CIA did intervene time and time again. It did make sure that dictators ended up running the show. It did make sure that human rights atrocities were hushed up. So the paranoia that is still there, which makes every African you meet think that the CIA is probably behind that, is completely justified.
Mobutu befriended several U.S. presidents up into the 1990s, including Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush. Mobutu consolidated power by publicly executing political rivals, secessionists, coup plotters, and other threats to his rule. Many were hanged before large audiences. Russia. The first Russian president after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin, won a second term in 1996 presidential elections, despite having a popularity rating of 8%, thanks to the extensive assistance provided by a team of media and PR executives from the United States. According to the cover story of Time magazine, these were Stephen Moore, Joe Shoemate, Felix Brainin, George Gorton, and Richard Dresner, who worked in Russia 4 months and received $250,000 each, plus payment of all costs and an unlimited budget to conduct surveys and other activities. Campaign strategists for the former Republican governor of California, Pete Wilson, such as George Gorton, covertly made their way to the presidential hotel in Moscow, where, behind guards and locked doors, served as Yeltsin's secret campaign weapon to save Russia for the quote-unquote sake of democracy. Felix Brainin, a Soviet immigrant to the U.S. who is wealthy consultant to American business interests working in Russia, began assisting the Yeltsin campaign. After he asked about American advisors who could help, San Francisco lawyer Fred Lowell suggested Gorton and Joe Shoemate, an expert on political polling, and Richard Dresner, a political strategist who has helped not only Wilson but President Clinton in his earlier campaigns for governor of Arkansas. Before the election, they were told that their involvement had to be treated like a state secret because of the fears that the communist candidate, Gennady Zyuganov, would use his presence to try to perpetuate anti-Western sentiment among Russian voters. The U.S. political consultants worked in hiding on the 11th floor of the Kremlin's presidential hotel in downtown Moscow for 6 weeks. Staying at the hotel is by invitation only. About 2 weeks after Yeltsin won his re-election campaign on June 16, 1996, the U.S. political consultants assigned to Yeltsin briefed reporters on their role in the campaign.
President on my right and Steve Moore is sitting over in the back over here. We're American political consultants who have been involved in the presidential campaign in Russia for the last 4.5 months. And so we just thought we'd be here, and we're happy and pleased and excited to finally be able to tell the story. And so we're just be open to your questions. Yeah.
Could you just sum up why you had this success and Yeltsin? What were the factors in your opinion?
Yeah. Well, I think the factors were coming across with a clear message and repeating the message. The first and most important thing I think we did was convince President Yeltsin that what he needed to do was get out and campaign in Western-style campaigning. And by Western-style campaigning, we mean get out of Moscow, go out and be among the people and do what we unabashedly admit are photo ops. Whether they supported the communists or supported the Democrats, mainly they wanted stability. And so we asked the president to address that, and he did so. So I would say the 3 important contributions we made was to get him on message and the 3 different messages, and I think that the results bore out. So we were able to do focus groups on the Video International ads and tell them which lines worked, which lines didn't. For instance, in some of their ads, they had lines talking about how good things were now. We found that ads that talked about how bad things were under the communists worked a hell of a lot better than ads that talked about good things now, because most people didn't think things were good now. So we were able to throw lines out for them, and we were able to throw some whole commercials out for them, and we were able to work with them, especially on their negative ads, in a way that I think softened them in some degree, and I think made them more effective. But they get the credit.
Who hired you?
Well, we were hired, we were brought over by Felix Brainin, who was a Russian-American businessman from San Francisco, and the actual words "you're hired" were spoken by First Deputy Prime Minister Oleg Soskovitz, who was in charge of handling the campaign at that time. He was in charge of the campaign.
Did it exceed the $3 million?
You know, this is the first campaign since the 1972 Nixon campaign that I worked on, where we had essentially an unlimited budget. We were told to do whatever we thought we needed to do, and we hired 3 different polling companies, which we went out and hired ourselves because we wanted to make sure that we believed in the polling companies. We told them that we were told that we couldn't tell them we worked for the Yeltsin campaign. So we told them that we were American, we represented an American company that wanted to sell thin screen TVs in Russia. And it was a fiction that we kept up almost till the end, and the polling companies saw through it probably a month out. It just got to be too ridiculous.
You mentioned that you have a pretty good expense account for doing all the projects and so forth. Who paid your salaries, you 3?
We got our salaries from a bank that was that the money was transferred through, and we don't know. We assume it came from the campaign.
Which bank?
Well, you know what? We're not going to go into that.
I'm a bit confused. I want to get one thing straight in my mind. You aren't quite sure who exactly approved and hired you for this whole thing, and you don't know who actually paid you?
We know who hired us. It was Oleg Soskovitz,
who was head of the campaign
at
and
that
also
time.
first deputy prime minister.
And we know what bank gave us the money. Can we tell you for sure who gave the bank the money and where it came from? No.
What was your collective fee for this period of time?
You know, we've decided not to say that too. Sorry.
How do you see the role that you played there? I mean, the time, I think, headline was that you saved Yeltsin. I mean, how significant do you think your role was?
Well, I think our role was probably more significant in this campaign than any campaign I've been involved in. And I've been involved in campaigns for 25 years. And it's hard to assess in any given time. But in any given campaign, you know, who provided what and what have you. But I would say more significant than any campaign I've been involved in.
Well, I don't know what other campaigns you've been involved in, so I can't judge. I mean,
The way I'd put it is, I think we played a significant role. You had, and I wouldn't say I wouldn't want to come to the conclusion that we played the most significant role, the least, or the most role I've ever played in a campaign necessarily. But I'd point out to you that Time magazine independently over a 4-week span came to a conclusion that gave us a pretty substantial impact on the campaign, as did ABC. And even the Washington Post, to whom we never talked, came to the conclusion on Sunday that it was one of the 3 or 4 reasons why Yeltsin won. So I would come to the conclusion that we played a very significant role.
Washington Post wrote that your group was top secret. Was it true?
Yeah, absolutely. Top secret. Well, first of all, it was so secret that they made it clear that they would be happier if we never left the hotel. They gave us rooms to sleep in on the same floor as our office, and they gave us 2 armed guards and a former KGB driver to take us around. The general thought was, or what they expressed to us, was 2. One, the first thought was that that this would be playing into the communist hands, and they would be able to say that Yeltsin was a tool of the Americans. And the second one was that there's so much intrigue in this campaign that we need to separate you from that and keep you up and above and out of it.
What's your personal attitude to that problem? I mean, from the point of view maybe of morality or social responsibility. The campaign, the Yeltsin campaign, lied to their voters about your presence there.
Well, I think that one of the things that people said in focus groups, I think you have to keep your eye on the larger picture here. The real issue here was whether Russia would turn towards democracy or turn back towards a totalitarian system, and I want to separate the economic from the political. I think they did a lot of things that, if you go back in American history, you'd see were done in places like Chicago and so on. But given what was at stake, those are really minor details. And to me, you know, I'm very proud that I had something to do with helping democracy take root in Russia.
The attack on the integrity of our elections, the security of our country. The integrity of our democracy is at stake.
When you meet with any Russians, you're meeting with Russian intelligence, and therefore President Putin.
Into Russian collusion.
Of collusion with suspected Russian operatives.
About potential collusion.
Meddling, and perhaps was there collusion? A lot of questions about his relationships with Russia.
President Yeltsin got about the vote he was predicted to get in the polls, and Mr. Zyuganov got more than he was predicted to get in the polls. But you know, polling is inexact, and I think that the main thing is there seems to have been a heavy majority of people who voted for the democratic process and for the path of reform, and that's good news.
But I can tell you as a fact, as someone who was sent to Russia to get involved in their elections, all the major opposition parties in Russia were concerned about my work there and said I had to stop meddling in their elections. That irony is not lost on me.
Reports, one could see that what you were writing was that today's meeting with President Bill Clinton was going to be a disaster.
Так вот, не первый раз я вам говорю, что вы провалились.
Well, now for the first time I can tell you that you're a disaster.
Be sure you get the right attribution there.
Anderson, talking about transparency, I just posted an article at the American Spectator. In doing my research, I came across an interview with Dick Morris at Newsmax in September of 2016, in which he says that President Clinton personally in 1996 meddled and colluded, if you will, in the Russian election to elect Boris Yeltsin.
As much as any other single person in Russia, and probably more than any other single person, he wanted Russia to be a free country that picked its leaders by elections.
You were sent by the U.S. government?
By the Clinton administration. To get involved. I worked for the Central Election Commission there, trying to steer their election law, and afterwards trying to help candidates.
And Hillary, on Saturday, gave a speech warning Putin against interfering in the U.S. elections. And the FBI has talked about foreign interference, and Obama has warned about it. Now, this goes back to something that happened in 1996. When I worked for Clinton, Clinton called me and said, I want to get Yeltsin reelected as president of Russia against Zhirinovsky, who was the communist who was running against him. And Putin was Zhirinovsky's major backer. And it became public that Clinton would meet with me every week. We would review the polling that was being done for Yeltsin, that was being done by a colleague of mine who was sending it to me every week. And Clinton and I would go through it, and Bill would pick up the hotline and talk to Yeltsin and tell him what commercials to run, where to campaign, what positions to take. He basically became Yeltsin's political consultant. And I think that Putin resented that, hated it, felt that it was an inappropriate intervention by Bill Clinton.
Around the same time, the Clinton administration secured a $10.2 billion International Monetary Fund loan to Russia as it was drowning in the economic and social disaster in the aftermath of the breakup of the USSR. This was done in order to keep the national economy and pro-Western government afloat. The loan funds were fraudulently misused by Yeltsin's inner circle, and the IMF knowingly turned a blind eye to this. Although the aggressive pro-Yeltsin campaign boosted his approval rating from an initial 6% to 35% in the polls during the first round of elections, and later made him win the second round against the communist candidate Gennady Zyuganov with 54% of the vote to 40%. There were widespread speculations about the rigged nature of the official results, but Yeltsin was reelected. On August 9th, 1999, Vladimir Putin was appointed to one of 3 first deputy prime minister positions, and later on that same day was appointed acting prime minister of the government of the Russian Federation by President Yeltsin. Yeltsin also announced that he wanted to see Putin as his successor. Later on the same day, Putin agreed to run for the presidency. A few days later, Putin was officially appointed by the Duma as prime minister, the 5th prime minister in an 18-month time span. On the 31st of December 1999, Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned, and according to the Constitution of Russia, Putin became acting president of the Russian Federation. The first presidential decree that Putin signed ensured that corruption charges against the outgoing president and his relatives would not be pursued. In a sense, the U.S. is responsible for the rise of Vladimir Putin in Russia by tipping the scales in favor of their preferred candidate in 1996, Yeltsin, who in turn appointed Putin as prime minister in 1999, and then quickly resigned. In more recent years, since the 2016 U.S. presidential elections, many corporate media outlets in the U.S. have accused Russia of either hacking our election, meddling in our elections, or collusion in a vast conspiracy to elect Donald Trump. The Russian government and Vladimir Putin deny any election interference.
Других стран, тем более Соединенных Штатов. Но мы будем работать с любым президентом, за которого проголосует американский народ. Хотя я не думаю, кстати говоря, что вот они всех учат, как надо жить, и демократии учат. А что, вы считаете, что там демократические выборы президента, что ли? Это правда. Посмотрите, там дважды в истории США избирали президентом человека, за которым большинством голосов выборщиков, а за этими выборщиками стояло меньшее количество избирателей. Это что, демократия, что ли? Значит, когда мы дискутируем иногда с коллегами. Мы никого ни в чем не обвиняем, мы дискутируем. Нам говорят, не лезьте, это не ваше дело, мы так привыкли. Так и хочется сказать, ну да, не лезьте к нам. Чего вы лезете-то? Разберитесь у себя сначала. Но повторяю, действительно, это не наше дело. Хотя, по-моему, там даже прокурору отгоняют от участков международных наблюдателей в ходе избирательных кампаний. Американские прокуроры пугают их, что в тюрьму посадят. Вот. Но это их проблемы. Они так привыкли, им нравится.
2006 Palestinian elections. During the 2006 Palestinian elections, Israel hoped that Fatah would prevail over Hamas, the latter being a Sunni Islamic fundamentalist organization. Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon wanted to halt the elections if Hamas ran candidates. However, U.S. President George W. Bush objected to such election interference, and Hamas won, despite millions of dollars flowing from the Bush administration to Fatah during the closing weeks of the campaign. Then Senator Hillary Clinton commented at the time,
have troubled me deeply. I do not think we should have pushed for an election in the Palestinian territories. I think that was a big mistake. And if we were going to push for an election, then we should have made sure that we did something to determine who was going to win. We should have made sure that we did something to determine who was going to win. Determine who was going to win.
Afghanistan elections, 2014. Presidential elections were held in Afghanistan on April 5, 2014, with a second round held on June 14th. Opinion polls showed Abdullah Abdullah, a former Mujahideen doctor, and Ashraf Ghani, a former World Bank technocrat, as the frontrunners during the election. In the first round of elections, Abdullah was in the lead. On the second set, came after the runoff election on 14th of June. Preliminary results were delayed because of widespread accusations of election fraud. In September 2014, the Independent Election Commission named Ashraf Ghani as the winner. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry sat with Abdullah Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan on July 12, 2014, after he helped broker a power-sharing agreement to resolve the disputed outcome of the election between them. A new position was opened up with the title of Chief Executive, which Abdullah was appointed to.
Ballot counting continues after Afghans braved threats of violence to go to the polls in record numbers. Presidential candidate Ashraf Ghani.
We've proven that we are a people of the ballot, not of the bullets. The Afghan public appreciates democracy, believes in it, and is willing to make it work.
Sporadic complaints of voting irregularities do not appear to have shaken Afghans' faith in the democratic exercise. Presidential contender Abdullah Abdullah.
We have registered our complaints. We have processed those complaints and referred it to the relevant commission, which is the Independent Election Complaints Commission. And hopefully those complaints will be dealt with duly.
At more than 12 years, the Afghan war is America's longest. President Obama pledged to bring it to an end while preserving hard-fought gains in the country. The administration views a successful transfer of power, overseen by increasingly capable Afghan security forces, as validation of their surge and withdraw strategy.
2009 Honduras election. In 2009, former president of Honduras, Manuel Zelaya, was promoting a controversial, non-binding poll on whether to include a fourth ballot box in the November elections of whether to have a constitutional convention or rewrite the Constitution. He had ignored a restraining order in this regard. Opponents said his goal in doing so was to extend his term, although, as scheduled, the balloting would have been simultaneous with the election of his successor. The 2009 Honduran coup, part of the 2009 Honduran constitutional crisis, occurred when the Army of Honduras followed orders from the Honduran Supreme Court on June 28, 2009, to remove President Manuel Zelaya and send him into exile. On 28th of November 2010, WikiLeaks released over 250,000 confidential documents which detail messages between the U.S. State Department and the U.S. embassies around the world. One of these documents was written by U.S. Ambassador Hugo Lawrence in late July 2009, which analyzes the legality of the removal of President Zelaya under the Honduran constitution. Lawrence concluded that although Zelaya might have committed illegalities and even violated the Constitution, there is no doubt that the military, Supreme Court, and National Congress conspired on June 28th in what constituted an illegal and unconstitutional coup against the executive branch. Emails released later showed that the 2009 Honduras coup was supported by Hillary Clinton's State Department. Clinton and her team worked behind the scenes to stall efforts by neighboring countries through the Organization of American States to restore Manuel Zelaya to office. The OAS meeting today turned into a non-event, just as we'd hoped, wrote senior State Department official Cheryl Mills, celebrating their success in slow-walking a resolution. Secretary Clinton had also helped organize the elections that she said would be strategized on a plan to restore order in Honduras and ensure that free and fair elections could be held quickly and legitimately, which would render the question of Zelaya moot and give the Honduran people a chance to choose their own future. Zelaya was overthrown just 3 weeks after Clinton's visit to Honduras for the Organization of American States. These are just a few examples of many instances of when the United States has interfered in the elections of other countries. While some Americans are screaming from the hilltops that our elections might be influenced by another country, it's been routine U.S. behavior for decades, and it hasn't stopped. Recently, former CIA Director James Woolsey humorously admitted that the U.S. continues to interfere in the elections of other nations.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably. But it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over. For example, in Europe, in 47, 48, 49, the Greeks and the Italians, we
don't do that now, though? We don't mess around other people's elections,
only for a very good cause.
Can you do that? Do a Vine video on a former CIA director.
Only for a very good cause in the interests of democracy.
All right, thanks for being here.
Only when Americans are able to look at themselves in the mirror and acknowledge the illegal actions of the U.S. government will things ever change. Otherwise, the same games we play on other countries might come back to bite us in the ass later.